Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to our final webinar in the 2021 Funded Chair Series on the Sustainable Development Goals. Many of you I have seen in other webinars, so it's great to see you join also for this one. And it is hopefully something that has been informative in advancing our understanding of the Sustainable Development Goals. I should point out that Arthur's seminar was initially planned for August, was then wiped out by our second round of COVID alert level changes. Back then, it was designed as a seminar in hybrid function. Now we're going to a webinar to make sure that well-being is well looked after and protected. So thank you for joining. The topic of today's presentation is well-being and the SDGs. So it's quite a broad topic, not as specific as some of the other ones, but I think that's going to be one of the really interesting aspects of this. Professor Arthur Grimes is joining us today as the speaker. He is the chair in Wellbeing and Public Policy at Wellington School of Business and Government, and he is also a senior fellow at Motu Economic and Public Policy Research. He also had a life previously as a former chairman and chief economist of the Reserve Bank, and it's great to have him here today. And before I hand over to Arthur, I would like to remind everybody that this is a series that has now been running since earlier in the year. And this is, in fact, truly the final one for 2021. In 2022, we're hoping to have something similar, but with a slightly different angle, but again, focused on the SDGs. So as I am about to hand over, I wish to just contextualize briefly that this presentation will be about SDG 3, good health and well-being, but from a much broader perspective and subjective aspects of well-being. So on that note, I hand over to Professor Arthur Grimes. Thank you, Arthur.
Thanks very much, Christian. Do that one. Looks like I have to do this again. Here we go. Hopefully you can all see that. Fine. Yep, great. So thank you very much for that introduction, and it's great to be able to participate in this series. We started with an introduction about COVID and lockdowns, and I'll finish on that in this presentation. So as Christian said, the area of the SDGs that I work in is most closely related to SDG 3, good health and well-being, which is obviously one of 17 sustainable development goals. This particular one has 13 targets, 26 indicators. And if we look at those, most of those indicators focus on physical health, and actually none of them, zero, focus on subjective well-being, or in other words, on how people rate their own well-being, which is really quite an anachronism in this sort of modern day when we look at well-being across the world, that the SDGs have no mention of how people rate their own life. So I'm going to try and expand on what the SDGs, the SDG approach. So what are some of the other approaches other than the SDGs that take a broader approach to well-being? Well, we can go back many years, perhaps 50 or 60 years in terms of academic work on this, but I'm going to start with the Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi report, which President Sarkozy of France commissioned back in 2008. And their objective was to look at measures that could replace GDP or supplement GDP to determine how well a country is doing. And one of their conclusions was that countries should measure both objective and subjective well-being. So that goes back to the 2000s. At around the same time, in fact, slightly earlier, we had another prominent politician in that case, David Cameron, who was then Prime Minister of the UK, saying, wealth is about so much more than pounds or euros or dollars can ever measure. It's time we admitted that there's more to life than money, and it's time we focus not just on GDP, obviously gross domestic product, but on GWB, general well-being. And I put these two things up to start with because it's interesting that here we have a centre-right Prime Minister of the UK, David Cameron, and a centre-right President of France, President Sarkozy, both championing well-being as the main target for policy. And for those of us in New Zealand, where we see well-being often being thought about and talked about from a centre-left government perspective, what this tells us is that this is not particularly a centre-left approach. This is actually goes right across the board in terms of political agendas around the world. But if we go back to the centre left, I suppose we can also go back a lot further. Bobby Kennedy, in a very famous speech he gave to University of Kansas in 1968, shortly before he was assassinated, had a very long speech. But part of it, he talked also about, even if we can act to erase material poverty, there is another greater task. It is to confront the poverty of satisfaction, of purpose and dignity that afflict us all. And what he was getting at in that talk was another aspect of well-being, which is what Aristotle called eudaimonia, which is, we can roughly think of as your purpose in life. Do you have control over your life? Do you think you're living a good life? And this is a very strongly held aspect of well-being amongst philosophers. It's not one that I'm going to deal with much today, and it lies pretty much beyond the ambit of governments, I think. But it's an interesting area for personal well-being as well, whether people have a strong purpose in life. Going back at 2,500 years, we have Confucius very nicely summarizing what I think governments should be trying to do. He says, there is good government when those who are near are made happy and when those who are afar are attracted. So in other words, we can tell whether a government is doing well by whether people want to move to that place, whether it's local government or central, and also whether people want to leave there. So we see many people wanting to come to New Zealand and a lot of people wanting to leave Syria, for instance. It's quite a good measure. Interestingly, Confucius was writing at about the same time as the great Greek philosophers were writing on the same subject on the other side of the world. So what about in New Zealand? We all know about New Zealand's wellbeing budget back in 2019. Which, as a quote, news of New Zealand's proposed wellbeing budget took the Davos World Economic Forum by storm earlier this year. But the question when we look at these sorts of approaches to policy is, what do we mean by well-being? So I'm going to talk about that. I'll talk about very briefly about two different well-being policy approaches that are used around the world. I'll talk briefly about some other countries' experiences in terms of running policies targeted at well-being. And then I'll summarize some of my own research in this area to give you a flavor of how we can use well-being research to answer various policy issues. So what do we mean by well-being? Well-being is a term now that is used, but actually it's almost exactly the same as the term welfare that we have used for the last 100 years or so, at least in the economics literature. So if we look at the Oxford English Dictionary, the shorter Oxford English Dictionary, it says well-being is the state of being or doing well in life, a happy, healthy or prosperous condition, or simply welfare. And when it comes to define welfare, it says good fortune, happiness, or well-being. So what we now say is a well-being agenda is very much what we've talked about as a welfare agenda in the past, but not in the sense that the Americans use welfare as being on a benefit. It's talking about people's overall welfare. And in fact, the founder of economics in this area, Pigou, talked about total welfare as opposed to economic welfare. He thought about economic welfare as being things within the measuring rod of money, and total welfare is including all aspects of what improves our life. In other words, what we would now call well-being. I co-chair the World Wellbeing panel with 3 others, and our sort of raison d'etre in this panel is saying that the World Wellbeing panel is about the promotion of well-being as the ultimate purpose of all major decision makers, particularly government. And interestingly, on this panel, we have about 50 experts from around the world, and they're not just economists. They have economists, psychologists, sociologists, philosophers, and from a wide range of countries with different developmental status. So this is an area that's got worldwide appeal now. It's not just a particularly local sort of New Zealand angle. So what are the 2 main approaches to wellbeing policy that have been used by policymakers in recent decades? The first one we can attribute to Amartya Sen, which is the capabilities approach, and also Martha Nussbaum is another prominent proponent of this approach. And Sen argues that policies should be designed to improve people's capabilities or their opportunities or freedom to pursue well-being. And in a typical economist sort of jargon, we'd have called that our making sure that we have the widest opportunity set that we can have. In other words, we have the opportunity to pursue a whole lot of different things with our lives. And then Sen would argue that it's not up to government then to choose from amongst those. What the government's role is to make sure that we have the opportunity or the capability to pursue different avenues in our life, and then to leave it at that. One issue with this approach is who chooses which capabilities should be targeted. Sen is silent on that, and deliberately so. Nussbaum is more paternalistic in that she names which capabilities should be adopted. And in fact, if one wants to operationalize this approach, one has to basically come down with a list of capabilities that governments and others should make sure that we all have. One related approach to the capabilities approach is the multidimensional poverty approach, which sets thresholds below which we don't want anyone to fall across a whole range of different areas. And that, in many ways, that's what the SDGs do. They set a set of sort of basic thresholds above which we each hope that each country's individual citizens can rise above. I think of the capabilities approach as very much along the lines of the old debate between equality of opportunity and equality of outcomes. No one ever believed typically in equality of outcomes, but many people, especially on the libertarian sort of end of the spectrum, argue that really the government's role is to emphasize equality of opportunity, which essentially is equality of capabilities, from which then people can choose to do whatever they wish after that. The other main approach to policy on well-being these days is the subjective well-being approach, which is a modern manifestation of utilitarianism philosophy, going back to Bentham and Mill and others. And here the idea is that you design policies to maximize people's evaluative subjective well-being. And a typical evaluative subjective well-being question is when we ask people in surveys, all things considered, how satisfied are you with your life as a whole these days? And there are other variants of this. One known as the Cantrell ladder is slightly more complex, asked in the Gallup poll across 150 countries. The question I've just used there is used in the World Values Survey. It's used in most general social surveys by stats agencies around the world, including New Zealand. And there are many economists who have adopted this approach. Dick Eastlin at the bottom there has been writing on this for the last 50 years or so, since 1974. Carol Graham there is a strong proponent. Richard Layard, Professor Layard or Lord Layard in the UK, Jeffrey Sachs, many others people who've, John Halliwell in Canada. So this is an approach that's used by many economists, also sociologists, and to some extent by psychologists such as Ed Diener, who actually just died earlier this year. It's now used in what we call cost well-being analysis, which is an extension of cost-benefit analysis, where we measure benefits according to how different policies contribute to people's subjective well-being. So this is now at the heart of some policy approaches around the world. And just a brief history on that. As I say, it's based on classical utilitarianism. Jeremy Bentham talked about targeting the greatest happiness of the greatest number. And I think it's important to actually think about what that has led to over the last 200 to 300 years. with Bentham's utilitarian approach of maximizing happiness of the greatest number, it was a strong democratization agenda. He said no person to count more than another. In other words, he was in 1780 when he was writing, he argued that the pauper was just as important as the aristocrat, and we should put as much weight on the pauper as the aristocrat. It led to calls for equal rights for women, because all people should be counted the same, equal rights for homosexuals, this is back in 1780, equal rights for non-believers, and also rights for animals. And modern philosophers have taken this approach in terms of arguing for the rights of animals. Around the same time, Mary Wollstonecraft used it to argue for the rights of women. John Stuart Mills shortly afterwards also argued that a moral agent should choose the action that maximizes the total happiness in the world, and also wrote, of course, about the rights of women. So this has got a very, very strong background to it in terms of arguing to make people's lives better and making all people's lives better, not just those in the top of the aristocracy. Different countries have taken different approaches when it comes to well-being policy agendas. Perhaps the first explicit one was Bhutan, with its gross national happiness. That started in 1972. And their approach is very much like the SDGs. It's basically sets a whole set of thresholds, which they try and get their citizens above. And rather than thinking about total happiness, in fact, it's a misnomer in Bhutan, the gross national happiness. It's really a multi-dimensional poverty approach where they say we're trying to get people above these thresholds in terms of their housing or their education or their health, or also their spirituality in Bhutan's case. Unfortunately, since 1972, it's actually a country that has made few tangible improvements. And it's one of the less happy countries in the world when you measure overall satisfaction with life. So it hasn't been a particularly effective approach. Australia started a wellbeing agenda back in 2004. The Australian Treasury had the Australian Treasury wellbeing framework many years before New Zealand's Treasury embarked on the same idea. But unfortunately, it was scrapped. And the reason it was scrapped under about 5 years ago was that they couldn't find a way to implement it in a way that was satisfactory to help prioritize policies. They had a similar approach to the New Zealand Treasury, a mixture between the capabilities and utilitarian approaches, but that wasn't found useful for policy purposes, and so it was scrapped. France again beat New Zealand to the game in 2015, passing a law where the government had to specify certain broad policies and targets in terms of a number of different measures of well-being, but it very quickly went into abeyance when governments found that it was quite difficult to justify their policies that they wanted to do against their targets for well-being. So they actually basically just ignore it, even though it's still in the law in France. Wales, at the same time, introduced the Future of Wales Act, which targets well-being, again, well before New Zealand did the same thing. And the one good thing about the Welsh approach, which is still in place, is that it applies to all public organisations in Wales who have to talk about how their policies are going to improve the well-being of the populace, and also they have to show how it will improve the well-being in the future as well, hence the Future of Wales Act. And the nice thing about the Welsh one is that their Auditor General has the power to audit whether public agencies are actually meeting their well-being agendas that they've put out. And then there is a person who stands in the place of future generations, who has the same auditing function to think about policies from the perspective of the future generation. So it has a stronger accountability framework than other frameworks have done, much stronger than New Zealand's one. The United Arab Emirates is interesting. It has a framework that's very much based around the cost well-being analysis agenda, which is where cost-benefit analysis has been extended to include explicit subjective well-being measures. It's the most elegantly crafted policy agenda, policy framework of any country. but it's oddly sits in a country with horrific human rights, and only 15% of people are citizens, and the framework applies only to citizens. So the other 85% of people are left out, and if people disagree with the government, they can be jailed or executed or kidnapped or whatever. So it's a rather odd situation of a very elegant framework in a horrific country. In New Zealand, some years after all of these ones, we introduced the Living Standards Framework with Treasury, which is a dashboard approach of indicators modelled on the Better Life Index of the OECD. It's actually just been updated in 2021 in the last month, but still as a dashboard approach where there's a whole lot of indicators of a whole bunch of domains: housing, health, education, social, civic engagement, and all sorts of other things. And like most of these other approaches, the earlier approaches, being a dashboard, it has no element in it which helps governments to prioritise policies. As a result, it's not very useful, in my view, as a guide to implementing policy for well-being purposes, because it's just a bunch of indicators of a whole lot of things, 60 or 80 indicators or however many you want. How do you actually choose between them and choose policies on the back of that? Interestingly, the New Zealand Treasury does have CBACS, which is the cost-benefit analysis model, and this now has incorporated elements of the UK's Green Book, which is the UK Treasury's approach to cost-benefit analysis, which explicitly includes cost well-being analysis now. So both the New Zealand approach and the UK Treasury approach to cost-benefit analysis now explicitly incorporate subjective well-being. And so much more the foundation of well-being policy analysis than is the Living Standards Framework. Living Standards Framework is really a red herring, and it's the CBACS where we should be looking to
later on.
Sorry, we've got somebody's unmuted. There we go. So it's the CBACS that we should be looking to for a guide to well-being policy analysis in New Zealand rather than the Living Standards Framework. So how can we apply well-being in our research, especially subjective well-being? And I'll just give you a smorgasbord, very, very quick smorgasbord of some of my recent research. Most of it's with students or research assistants, just to give you an idea how we can actually implement some of these ideas as to help guide policy. So I just supervised a student a year or so ago, Leah Haynes, Master of Public Policy student, who won the prize for the top Master of Public Policy student. And the paper that we developed out of her work looks at how we can use a modified version of the Treasury's Living Standards Framework to help guide policy. And one of the things with the Living Standards Framework, as I said, it's a dashboard which includes housing, health, education, and a whole bunch of things. It also includes subjective well-being as one of its components of the dashboard. And what we did was to say, well, let's put the subjective well-being, how we rate our lives overall, at the top of a hierarchy and put the other domains of the Living Standards Framework as contributors to that. So your housing contributes to your overall well-being, your education contributes to your overall well-being, your health does as well, etc. And then we said, well, if we do that and we use data covering the population from the General Social Survey, what is it that matters most to a particular population group? And in this case, it was mothers and children who are in material hardship. And interestingly there, we found that aspects such as housing was probably the most important contributor to subjective well-being, as well as, of course, material standard of living as well, but also things like safety and some other aspects. And one of the nice things about this paper, and it was really Leah's concentration here, was bringing a gendered perspective into it to show that what matters for mothers with dependent children who are in material hardship is quite different to what matters for, say, males in general. For instance, employment is particularly important for males when it comes to their subjective well-being. But if you're a mother with dependent children and you're in material hardship, employment is not overall a contributor to improving your well-being when you're busy, trying to look after the children as well. That's after controlling for income though. So it's a very important contribution, I think, in that way. One of the other things that we have looked at with another former student, Tom Carver, is even if we look at material well-being, what sort of measures should we look at? And here what we looked at is to go back to an idea that economists have long had, to use permanent income rather than current income as a measure of material well-being. And a measure of permanent income is actually how much you consume, because that's going to be based on how much wealth you've got and how much income you've got over your lifetime. And it turns out that consumption is a much better measure of material well-being than is income. And so we shouldn't be looking at things like GDP per capita. We should be looking more at consumption-based measures, even if we're looking at material income. And when we do look at consumption, some work I did with a former Victoria graduate, Sean Hyland, who was a research assistant with me and an intern with me, is to show that when we compare consumption living standards across countries, New Zealand actually does very, very well, much, much better than we do on measures like GDP per capita. So some of these measures that we've typically used are not very good, and New Zealand turns out to be one of the richer countries in the world rather than an also-ran when it comes to developed countries, which we look at in other ways. One of the areas that ideas that I had when I first got into this field quite a few years ago was to think, well, if subjective well-being is to be a guide for policy, it also has to be something that can predict what people actually do. In economist jargon, it has to be a revealed preference, help us with revealed preference indicators. And one of the strongest, most important decisions that people make is where they migrate to, whether they migrate, and if so, where to. And what I showed here with a colleague from Otago, Dennis Wesselbaum, in 2 different papers, was that we know from the migration literature that people tend to migrate for income reasons, but we showed that they also migrate for subjective well-being reasons. They tend to migrate from areas with low subjective well-being and to areas with high subjective well-being, even after taking account of income. So, and then if we look at that at a local level, some work I did with Kate Preston, who was a research assistant with me, we looked at migration within Australia, and we found the same idea. But here it's also different effects depending on whether for men and women. In the migration literature, we tend to know that migration has been dominated by decisions by males in the past, this is of couples in particular, and that males tend to get higher wages after they migrate, and female wages tend to drop or stagnate after they migrate. But interestingly, what we found when people migrate within Australia using panel data, here longitudinal data, is that actually women tend to become happier after they migrate, whereas men don't. So there was an interesting paradox there, perhaps. Another area where this area of subjective well-being is very helpful for us is in understanding how relativities shape how people view their life. Economists have typically thought about absolutes when it comes to how we value income and consumption, etc. But the work of Dick Easterlin, going back to 1974, shows that relativities, how we rate ourselves relative to others, how our income is relative to others, our standing in the pecking order also matters. And of course, sociologists and others have talked about this for a long time. And the paper that I wrote with Mark Reinhardt, another former student of mine, shows that yes, these relativities matter, and it's not just local relativities that matter of people around you, but also how we rate in terms of our incomes and other things relative to other countries. And this has got a little warning note here that it means that we can't just be parochial and look at aspects of economic policies, say within New Zealand. We also have to look at how incomes and other things are doing relative to other countries, and in our case, especially Australia, where people can migrate to if it turns out that incomes or quality of life is higher in Australia than it is here. So we judge ourselves relative to Australians, and unfortunately, Australia just keeps up digging up, new minerals and making themselves rich, which is unfortunate for us. 2 other aspects which were important, which we've looked at in the past, looked at in recent times. One is sustainability and one is distribution. Working with a PhD student, Mohammed Mubashir Qasim, we showed that there's a potential trade-off between well-being and sustainability. There are no win-wins when it comes to these sorts of things, as much as some people in the policy arena might like. What we showed there is that countries that tend to improve their sustainability, and we used a number of different measures of that, both from the economics literature and the ecological literature, countries that promote their sustainability tend not to do as well in promoting their well-being over the next decade, although there is some rebound in the following decade, 2 decades hence. So there is a classic sort of trade-off here between promoting sustainable policies, keeping our resources in our back pocket, if you like, for the future, and improving well-being now. And this is the classic political economy problem that we find, where governments keep on putting off actions, for instance, to do with climate change, because they want to improve well-being today. And finally, just an example, well, distribution as well, I should have talked about. But I'm working further with a student, Diana Tam, on the migration issue. And this one is an interesting paper, which we're just finalizing for a revision for a journal, where we're again looking at migration within Australia and using a bargaining model within the household to decide whether people migrate with couples, whether they migrate to do with wages or well-being, and if so, is it the well-being of the female partner or the male partner in a household with a male and female partner in it. With Diana, we've also worked on the importance of free speech for well-being and whether free speech matters more for people at the bottom of the heap or the top of the heap. It turns out that it matters more for people at the bottom of the heap, which is an interesting finding, and that's also being worked up for a journal at the moment. I had an outstanding master's student last year, Rowan Tom, who worked with me both at Motu and in his master's to look at how Maori land loss in the 19th century and early 20th century affects current cultural well-being of people from different iwi today. And of course, different iwi had different experiences of land loss. So we can take a historical perspective on some of these things as well. And with another student, Florencia Tranquilli, and also with Stephen Jenkins from London School of Economics, we've looked at inequality of well-being and how to measure that and what effects that has. So distributional aspects of well-being important as well. And finally, I'll just finish with another way that we can use well-being approaches, and that's to think about a current policy which is to do with COVID and lockdowns. Many of my well-being colleagues internationally, especially in the UK and Europe, have argued against lockdowns on the grounds that they reduce well-being of the population, that there are significant mental health effects of lockdowns and other effects. That means that lockdowns have negative effects. So we've looked at that in New Zealand. And one of the wonderful things that Statistics New Zealand did at the start of our first lockdown last year was to introduce questions from the General Social Survey on Wellbeing into the quarterly Household Labour Force Survey. So that started from the second quarter of last year, so just on the back end of the first national lockdown. And then it's continued every quarter since then, so we can follow through well-being effects of lockdowns and other aspects through that time. And here's just a little graph to give you a taster of what we can look at that. If we look at overall life satisfaction of people across New Zealand in 2018, which is the most recent General Social Survey, it averaged a 7.7 out of 10. This is on this sort of standard question about how you rate your life as a whole. And at the end of the first lockdown, the actual life satisfaction in New Zealand had gone up to 7.9, which is a big jump when it comes to these things. A jump of 0.2 is actually very large. It went down slightly with the next lockdown, with the Auckland lockdown, and then went ratcheted back up to 8 in December 2020. And what I've done more recently is to actually use the unit record data to analyse how these effects break down amongst different types of people, and especially in Auckland relative to other places. So we can start actually gauging the effect of policies on particular groups of people and in particular locations, spatial effects. And it turns out in the recent work I've done on Auckland that actually the Auckland lockdown, the second Auckland lockdown in September 20, did have a negative effect on Aucklanders relative to the rest of the country at that time. what economists call a difference in difference analysis using the unit record data. So this approach now is becoming very, very useful in looking at how we can evaluate different policies. So just some final thoughts. I think there are some really promising wellbeing approaches to policy. I'm not a fan of dashboards with lots of indicators and targets. They're not much use for prioritizing policies. And they don't tend to focus on disadvantaged groups, especially when they're put out at the aggregate level, although some of the threshold approaches, such as multidimensional poverty approaches like the SDGs, do actually tend to focus on disadvantaged groups, but then they ignore people who are more advantaged. So they have their disadvantages as well. And finally, I'd say that subjective wellbeing offers a way forward to understand what really matters for people's welfare. It's being used in policy analysis today in cost-benefit analysis or cost wellbeing analysis throughout the world. We can actually measure how different policies affect people's wellbeing and compare those with how they affect, how different other policies affect wellbeing. They're also very useful for looking at how different policies affect specific groups, such as the work I talked about before in terms of the well-being of mothers and with dependent children, as opposed to the well-being of other groups. Now, Christian, I'll leave it there for now. I'll stop sharing my screen if I can, and throw it over to you.
Thank you very much. That was very, very interesting, and of course, very much goes to the heart of the SDGs, because well-being and good health is SDG 3, but arguably well-being has a much deeper position across the SDGs. So that was really interesting. I would now like to invite our audience to type your questions into the chat box, which we found to be the most effective way of having a discussion at the end. So the chat is in your Zoom bar, and yeah, you can just write your questions to everybody else, so I can sort of manage and moderate them a little bit. While people are doing that, can I maybe start off with a question about that interesting position where you say that sustainability and well-being don't necessarily go hand in hand, which is a really interesting perspective, because in many conceptualizations of sustainability, well-being is a core component, social well-being, cultural well-being. So that's a really interesting perspective. Can you expand on that a little bit, please?
Yeah, well, I mean, typically governments, when they want to get re-elected, try to improve people's well-being in the short term, through expansionary budgets and, spending up large and wage subsidies or whatever else they want to sort of think of at the time. And these, we know from past experience in New Zealand how these have led to very unsustainable policies, high debt, and which basically reduces the well-being of future generations who have to pay off that debt. And of course, we went through the whole process up to 1984, and then post 84, we built up massive debt by trying to improve people's well-being in the short term, and then had to, next generation had to pay that back. And now, of course, in the last 2 years since COVID came along, we've built up a massive debt again for the next generation to pay off, although I think this one is a lot more, justifiable than previous attempts at doing it. And this is just a typical choice that people make at an individual level and a policy level between consumption today and consumption tomorrow, saving consumption today, saving for tomorrow. Now that saving can be in the form of financial assets, but it can also be saving in the form of preserving natural capital. We could be using up lots of our natural capital today, which would increase our current well-being, because we're becoming rich in the short term, but that natural capital is not there for the future. And so it's very much along the lines that we would expect from a standard sort of analysis, that if you want to put aside resources for the future, you're not using them today. So you're foregoing well-being today by doing that. There's a fantastic analysis of this by Kenneth Arrow and Partha Dasgupta and others. It's sort of probably the classic work on this back in 2014 or so, on how we can judge whether the well-being trajectory, if you like, of a country is also consistent with sustainability in terms of increasing the country's what they call comprehensive wealth over time, wealth measured including natural capital, human capital, and physical capital, etc. So this trade-off shouldn't be surprising to anyone, I think. What surprises me is people who think there's not a trade-off. I've always thought that, there's in the policy area, people always talk about these win-wins, but it's virtually never in my policy experience of 40 years that I see a win-win.
Interesting. And I suppose it comes down to how we conceptualize sustainability and whether we take a quite a holistic perspective or a more focused one, maybe. Very, very interesting. Can I also ask about the life satisfaction in December 2020? Was that the highest ever recorded, or how does it relate to other periods pre-COVID? Because that's a really astonishing insight into the mentality of New Zealanders during a fairly difficult time.
Yeah, it's the highest since Stats New Zealand has instituted that definition of well-being. Unfortunately, they used to have a 5-point scale and then they changed to an 11-point scale, so we can't compare that reading with times further back, but it's certainly higher than 2018, 16 and 14, which were the 3 previous surveys which had satisfaction measured on that scale. Yeah.
Cool. And now a question from Winston Roberts. I'm interested to know more about the research by Diana Tam into the impact of free speech on well-being.
Yeah, this was a fascinating project which I supervised Diana's master's work on this, and we've since written a paper on it. We used well-being data from around the world. The World Values Survey has been collecting data like this for the last 40 years across many different countries. And then we combine that with measures of free speech, which have been compiled by some US academics. And then we see whether changes in free speech in different countries after controlling for all sorts of other human rights in those countries and after controlling for GDP, income and all those sorts of things. In particular, we look at whether free speech is important for people who are high income or are highly educated, or people who are low income and lowly educated. And we had two sort of separate hypotheses here. One is that things like free speech might be a luxury good, as economists would term it. It's only when you get beyond a certain stage in Maslow's hierarchy that you start worrying about things like free speech, so that it would most benefit people at the top of the pyramid. On the other hand, people at the top of the pyramid often have access to governments and government officials and etc. So it may not be so important for them. It may be more important at the bottom end. And what we found very, very strongly in that, using this unit record data of so hundreds of thousands of observations or tens of thousands of observations of different people across many different, across decades and across many countries, was that it's the people at the bottom end who are most affected by changes in free speech, so who benefit most from free speech.
Excellent, thank you. And now a question from Shelley Cook, which is very relevant to Aotearoa, New Zealand, and also the Pacific. Is any work being done on exploring Te Ao Maori and or Pacifica approaches to well-being? This may address multi-generational well-being and narrow the gap to the sustainability trade-off. So yeah, very, very interesting.
That's a great question. There's been quite a lot of work done, especially on Te Ao Maori approaches to well-being, going quite a way back. I mean, Mason Dury would be obviously the classic one back in 1985 when he was writing about this in his social science and medicine paper on the 4 pillars, of Maori well-being. And interestingly, he came up with those 4 pillars after going and having hui around marae around the country and talking to the elders in particular. After that, that was sort of the dominant framework. Since then, people like Tahu Kukatai at Waikato University and others have worked with Suparu when it was still going to come up with another very nice framework. And then more recently, there's been other frameworks. Stats New Zealand worked on what's called the Te Kupenga survey, which is a general social survey designed especially for Maori. And again, that was very nicely done because it was done with very widespread consultation with Maori as to what the kinds of aspects of well-being that are particularly important to Maori. So it includes, for instance, questions on have you visited your traditional marae in the last 12 months, and these sorts of questions. So they're very different questions to what we'd ask elsewhere. More recently, both TPK and Treasury have designed Maori wellbeing frameworks. TPK came up with what's a very nice one. It's actually published as a Treasury working paper because it was being done at the time of the tax working group. And then Treasury at the same time came up with Heara Waiora, which is their own version done with consultation with a few people, but it's nowhere near as consultative as some of the other frameworks. But many of these approaches have very, very similar approaches. There's some Pacifica approaches as well, the Whanawhale approach, and more recent ones. And they tend to emphasize relationships between people and processes much more so than do the traditional Western frameworks, etc.
Wonderful. Yes, because I think also in Pacifica cultures, that intergenerational contract, so to speak, is much more pronounced in their conceptualizations of sustainability. So really interesting perspective to look at it through the cultural lens of what we even consider to be sustainability.
Yeah, and just on that, I'm doing work at the moment with a large Endeavour grant on public housing. And there we're working with Pacifica and Maori groups on specific aspects of Maori wellbeing and Pacifica wellbeing, and thinking about what framework should we use to measure well-being of tenants, Maori tenants and Pacifica tenants in public housing areas.
Excellent. It will be great to have you back to talk about that research soon. And now another question from Grant Spencer. Is there any international agency that is developing a standard approach that could be widely adopted?
Oh, good question, Grant. I think the approach that is the de facto one is probably the Treasury's, UK Treasury's Green Book, which I think most people around the world are looking at. They've incorporated something called WellBees in there, which is a well-being year, which is basically if you have a project that's has a certain return in terms of lifting people's subjective well-being. Let's say it's a particular project that'll lift somebody's well-being by a step of 1, from say a 7 to an 8 for 2 years. That's equivalent to a lift of 2. And if the average life satisfaction was 8, and then 2 divided by 8 would be a quarter of a well-being year. So it's very much along the lines of a quality adjusted life year in the health literature. This approach is now being adopted by a number of different agencies. It's not been adopted by an international agency as such, but it's probably the one that's most seizing people's attention at the moment.
And while I encourage debate about the SDGs, I'm not necessarily a complete convinced advocate, but could the SDGs provide such a framework, at least at some levels, because it is a global roadmap that articulates specific aspirations around well-being?
In my view, no. As you know, I'm not a fan of dashboard. You can see I'm not a fan of dashboard approaches. And also, the SDGs are really targeted at getting people above a certain threshold, which I think is incredibly important from a distributional aspect, but it doesn't help with designing policies for once you're above that threshold. And this is the problem also with the Bhutan approach, which is very similar. So there's no reason why the Wellbeing approach couldn't be incorporated into the SDGs as one aspect for that particular group. But I don't think it's, I see the SDGs as not particularly useful for other than getting people above a wide range of thresholds.
Excellent. And although some more questions have come in, which I'm very pleased about, I'm sorry, but we have to draw this webinar to a close because otherwise we will go over time. So thank you very much to the audience for your questions, for your participation. And most of all, of course, thank you very much to Arthur for sharing your research and sharing these really interesting perspectives on subjective well-being and how, or the many ways in which we can approach this topic. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Christian.
And please think about the mailing list if you have an interest in these types of seminars for next year. Thank you very much. Ka kite.
Ka kite.